Chapter 2, the research enterprise in psychology. Basic questions that we're going to be looking at in this lecture. What's the experimental method? What are the advantages and disadvantages of experimentation? Are there ethical issues in psychological research? Are there basic ethical standards for research using human subjects? Experimental research, looking for causes. So in contrast to correlational methods, you can make causal claims based on experimental research. It's a primary advantage of experimentation. We can make causal claims. So most good research starts with a hypothesis. So what's a hypothesis? Think of a hypothesis as a guess, an educated guess, or a prediction about what the outcome of a study will be. So you've got to lay out a bold hypothesis, a bold guess about what your study is going to show, and then go out and let the data speak for themselves. What's an experiment? It's a type of study that involves manipulation on an independent variable under controlled conditions so that resulting changes in a dependent variable can be observed. So you, the experimenter, have control over the independent variable, and you want to see what effect your manipulation, your changing of the conditions of that independent variable are going to have on some dependent variable. For example, we hypothesize that nicotine causes health problems. So the simple experiment to test this hypothesis would involve an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable, we're going to have nicotine, and we're going to have an experimental group and a control group. So nicotine is what we're going to manipulate. In our experimental group, we're going to give our subjects 50 milligrams of nicotine, and the control group will get a placebo. So the simplest type of experiment will have a single independent variable with two levels or two conditions of the independent variable. That is, one experimental group and one control group. And then we've got to measure something, and that's the dependent variable, sometimes referred to as a dependent measure. The dependent variable is the variable affected by the variation, that is the manipulation of the independent variable. So I'm going to change from the condition of experimental group to control group and see if there's any change in health problems. So in table form, we can see that the independent variable will be nicotine because that's what we're manipulating. Our two conditions are the nicotine group, the 50 milligram group, and then the placebo group. So we might give them saline or some other placebo. And then we're measuring health problems under each condition. And what we're looking for is a difference in health problems across these two conditions. And that's about as simple as it gets. Here's an actual experiment. Wood et al. Did a study, 74. White male university students were randomly selected to interview white and black male high school students seeking employment. One group of white university students was randomly assigned to interview white high school students. The other group of white university students was randomly assigned to interview black high school students. So these are our two groups, white and black students being interviewed by white subjects, research participants. The results: white interviewers of black applicants, that is compared to white interviewers of white applicants, sat farther away, conducted shorter interviews, and made more speech errors. So those were the results of this manipulation. Something to consider as we're reviewing these concepts. What's the independent variable in this study? If you guess the race of the high school students, you are correct. So they manipulated white and black. The independent variable would be the race, yeah, and the conditions would be white and black. Those are the two levels or the two conditions of that independent variable. What did they measure under each condition? So what are the dependent variables? So we've got three dependent variables actually. We've got the distance they sat, so they measured that. They measured the amount of time the interview took. They measured the number of speech errors. So this particular study had a single independent variable and 3 dependent variables. Concept check. Researchers studying the effects of sleep deprivation tested the physical coordination skills of 25-year-old males who had been sleep deprived for either 24, 36, or 48 hours. In this study, what's the independent variable? A, the age of the research participants. B, sleep deprivation. C, the length of time the participants had been sleep deprived. D, the physical coordination skills of the men in the study. So the independent variable would be sleep deprivation. Second bullet point, what are the conditions of the independent variable? That would be C, the length of time the participants had been sleep deprived. 24, 36, or 48 hours. Third bullet point, in this study, what's the dependent variable? What do they measure under each condition? That would be D, the physical coordination skills of the men in the study. Advantages and disadvantages of experimentation. Advantages, we got precise control, which we discussed in Lecture 1. That is, I set up my study under very, very rigorous conditions. I precisely define my terms, my independent variable, my conditions of my independent variable, and I set up the study so that I'm measuring these variables exactly. Conclusions about cause and effect can be drawn. So this is one of the greatest advantages of experimentation relative to correlational designs, is that once I've conducted the study and I've controlled all my variables, I can conclude that it was the effect of the independent variable, if indeed I do get an effect on the dependent measure. Disadvantages can seem artificial. So this is a constant challenge for experimentation in the behavioral sciences, particularly when you're studying phenomena that are a little sensitive or hard to get at, so to speak, in the laboratory setting. So sometimes, and we'll look at a study in a minute, sometimes subjects can kind of see through the cover story, if there is a cover story, and they can sort of guess what the experimenter is trying to get at. So sometimes it can be a little bit artificial. Experimenter bias can influence the results. That is, sometimes experimenters, even though they're supposed to be objective, can influence the outcome of their studies. They can push the results one way or the other. The solution that you read about is called the double blind, and this is a procedure in which the research assistant usually is kept blind to the hypotheses of the study. They don't know who's in the control group and who's in the experimental group, nor do the research participants. So if nobody knows what the hypothesis of the study is, nobody knows what the independent variable is, or the dependent, or the conditions of the independent variable are. If everybody's kept in the dark, so to speak, then it's very, very difficult for the experimenters to push the results one way or the other. Can't be used to explore all research questions. So there's practical issues, such as the one that I mentioned in the first lecture, the interest in studying the effects of secondhand smoke on health issues. So it would be very, very difficult to manipulate exposure to secondhand smoke. It would be practically impossible to do that, at least in human subjects. That's why animal models are used quite extensively for these kind of studies. It also presents certain ethical issues. It would be unethical to expose individuals and not others to potentially harmful cigarette smoke. So there's a whole host of ethical issues, one of which I want to focus on here, that is the use of deception in psychological research, how we treat human subjects with respect to lying to them to create compelling compelling environment so that they behave in a way that presumably they would in ordinary life, so that we can find out important things about possibly some unsavory aspects of human behavior. So the study I want to focus in here on is Stanley Milgram's studies in obedience. Stanley Milgram was a young social psychologist at Yale, and this is back in the early 60s. And he hatched a trajectory of research that became known as the Milgram studies in obedience to authority. And one of Milgram's first studies was conducted to discover how far individuals would go under the direct orders of an authority figure to harm another human being. So on the right here, this image, we can see the experimental setup was the experimenter over here, and then the research participant sat here in front of a very realistic looking shock generator. And then the confederate of the researcher who was working with the researcher sat over here. The cover story to the research participant was that this was a study in the effect of punishment on learning. So the idea was that the subject was kept in the blind, in the dark, so to speak, with respect to the partner over here, the learner. So the subject was assigned the role of the teacher. The research confederate was assigned the role of the learner. And then every time the learner made a mistake, the teacher was supposed to deliver increasingly painful electric shocks to sort of march up the shock generator here. So the idea was to see how far the subject would go, the participant would go on this shock generator. So in advance of the study, and that is when the experimenter is sitting over here giving direct orders, you must go on, the experiment must continue, and so forth. So in advance of the study, Milgram interviewed experts in human behavior, and their estimate was 1 to 3% of research subjects, participants, would deliver the highest level of shock. In actual fact, and this finding has been replicated under another multiple cross-cultural studies and with different subjects and samples and so forth, reliably more than expected deliver that highest level of shock. 65% delivered the highest degree of shock in Milgram's initial study, which was a shock to everybody because nobody had believed in their wildest dreams that people would obey the orders of a so-called authority figure and deliver potentially harmful electric shocks to other human beings. People surprised the researchers, essentially. So the question for us here in this chapter is the ethics of doing research that involves creating a cover story, a lie in essence, to create compelling circumstances that really reveal something about human behavior that we want to know something about. So in this case, it was the obedience of authority, the obedience to authority. The cover story was it was a study on teaching, or the effects of punishment on teaching, but the actual study was to see how far people would go. So the basic question is it okay to deceive these research participants? So after Milgram conducted his study, there was a firestorm of criticism. The critics suggested that deception is lying and it's immoral. It's not okay to lie under any circumstances. Subjects' ability to trust others may be undermined. So as a result of participating in a study in which they learned after the fact that they were deceived, it may impact their ability to trust other people thereafter. Subjects may feel foolish when the true purpose of the study is revealed. That is, once they discover they've been duped, then they might take a hit to their self-esteem. They feel like they were fooled, and that will be problematic for them. The primary issue advanced by the critics was that harm may be inflicted, not serious physical harm, certainly, but harm in some way. Response to the critics included the end can justify the means. So certainly there's things that we want to find out about human behavior that is difficult to get at in naturalistic settings. So we've got to conduct compelling experiments, set up compelling circumstances that get people to behave in such a way that we can find out something. And the end can justify the means, particularly when it's dealing with destructive obedience. the scientific knowledge that's created based on this kind of research outweighs the potential risks to the research participants in some cases. No evidence that deception undermines trust. So studies have been done subsequent to deception, the use of deception, that have shown that it doesn't really impact people's ability to trust other people. And then the last criticism here, or the response to the critics, is that maybe researchers are more concerned about the research participants than they are indeed about themselves. So we're maybe making kind of a big deal out of something that doesn't really deserve this much attention. But certainly the Milgram studies and others that came after it spoke to a need to develop ethical standards for research. That is, there must be something written, guidelines that outline what's okay and what's not okay with respect to the treatment of human and animal subjects. So these days, and if you go to the APA website, you'll find ethical standards. There's pages and pages of ethical standards. But the three I want to just mention here really quickly. Institutional Review Board, IRB. So if you conduct research under the auspices of a university or college, that research has to be passed. It's got to be given a green light by the IRB. The IRB is a panel of your colleagues that review carefully the costs and benefits and potential risks to the research participants, either human or animal. And if the study passes, you get a green light, go ahead, conduct your research. You might get a yellow light that would require you to revise your methods and then resubmit, or you might get a red light saying there's no way that you're going to be able to do that at this college or university. Come up with something else. So every study has to pass through IRB. Informed consent is something that the research participants are given in advance of their participation that lets them know a bit about what the nature of the study is, what they can expect, and so forth. And the idea is that they would be given enough information that they could decide whether or not they want to participate. They're also reminded that they can check out at any time. That is, if they are in the middle of the experiment and they don't want to continue, then they can leave with impunity. And then the debriefing is something that you get at the end of the experiment. And the debriefing, sometimes it's a piece of paper, or sometimes it's a talk debriefing, a discussion about the hypotheses of the study, what the researchers expect to find, and the implications of the findings that they expect. Any potential issues that the research participant might have, maybe they're stressed and so they're directed to counseling center or somebody that's in place to help them deal with their experience. And that's the debriefing. So these are the basic standards for research: IRB, informed consent, and debriefing. So this is what we looked at in this lecture 2. Describe the experimental method of research, explaining independent and dependent variables. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of experimentation. Summarize the ethical issue of the use of deception in psychological research and the arguments for and against its use. Summarize the basic ethical issues, the basic ethical standards for research using human subjects.